Hey everyone, today I'm joined by Jay McDaniel. Jay is a philosopher and process theologian, also professor emeritus of world religions at Hendrix College. Very involved in the process theology, process philosophy scene. Actually, we did a podcast together, you and I, with Jared Morningstar, which is really cool, which I can link. And yeah, I wanted to have Jay on to talk about sort of just outlining a little bit what the world of process Christianity looks like. There's an ongoing discussion right now, very robust and productive around metamodern Christianity, and and there are different forms that that can take, and Jay being sort of a well, I'll say an expert in the kind of process side of things. I thought that this was a really valuable lens to bring to the conversation and try to just make people aware of this as a whole framework. So we'll dive into that in a second. But Jay, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Appreciate
Oh,
it.
it's great to be here. Thank you. Thanks for
Yeah.
having me.
So as I said, like one of the things I just wanted to do here is to kind of make people aware of this particular approach, this framework for integrating the Christian tradition within this sort of so-called process lens. And so maybe the first thing you could do to help with that is just sort of like what is the process aspect of this mean? What is process theology? And what does a process-oriented Christianity look like?
In the 1960s, um, a person who became the premier process theologian in the United States, a man named John Cobb, um, went to grad school at the University of Chicago, was out of grad school by the time he became a process theologian. But he discovered, in his view, that the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, who combined cosmology and metaphysics and an interest in religion and had a very unique understanding of God, that philosophy might help Christians recover belief in God in light of modernist assumptions. And what Whitehead offered, among other things, was an organic view of the universe. So Whitehead critiqued the mechanistic view of the universe, which
Hmm.
understood it on the analogy of a machine, and proposed instead that the universe is much more like an organism where everything has a kind of vitality to it, a creativity to it. Whitehead himself was very influenced by early quantum mechanics.
Hmm.
So Whitehead actually thought that science too was or would undergo a revolution from mechanism to organism. Whitehead had written a book called Science in the Modern World, in which he made that case. And then he wrote this thick tome called Process and Reality,
Mm-hmm.
very difficult to read, in which he really laid out a whole scheme, a whole system. He didn't call it process philosophy, he called it the philosophy of organism. But the theme of becoming a process was very important to his perspective. So others began to call it process philosophy. And when you took that and applied it to Christianity, uh, you got process theology.
Hmm.
And something Whitehead did in Process and Reality, if you ever read the book, he really did develop a very unique way of understanding God that can both be religiously meaningful to ordinary Christians and Jews and Muslims, by the way, um, and at the same time, in Whitehead's view, quite consonant with the best of modern science and a whole lot of other things.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the dawn of process theology. And it was really through John Cobb, influenced by Alfred North Whitehead and a philosopher named Charles Hartshorne. It's had a long history since then, Brendan, and much has happened. Um, it's widened, it's become more ecumenical. It includes other religious traditions, but it's still very much a living option for many Christians. And I think the form it takes today, if you want to see aspects of process theology at work, I would look at the open and relational theology movement. Um, in particular, the work of Thomas Ord and Tripp Fuller.
Hmm.
Both of them are very influenced by John Cobb, and by the process tradition.
Cool. Yeah, and they just came out with a book, right? God After Deconstruction, I think.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
No, thank you. That's a very helpful kind of lay of the land overview. And I also want to plug this beautiful essay that you wrote, Christian Process Theology and Metamodernism,
Mm.
where you kind of lay out a lot of these ideas and try to sync it up with a lot of the conversation going on around metamodernism and metamodern Christianity. And I was very honored you engaged with some of my work here, but this is a very rich article, and I will also link this because there's so much in here to give people a sense of how this really can deepen sort of a theological vision. But so there's interesting ways in which it seems that a process view on Christianity both allows for some continuity with that tradition, but also
Right.
some discontinuity, right? I mean, what would you say are some of the novel aspects of a process Christianity or a process theology that might come as a bit of a surprise, let's say, to, I don't know, let's say just more traditional forms of Christian thought?
I'd like to name surprises to traditionalists, but also surprises to modernists and
Sure.
postmodernists.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think both can be surprised.
yeah.
Um, to the traditionalist, what will be familiar um, is Whitehead's notion that God has consciousness and aims and purposes
Hmm.
and works in the world in a continuous way, not in a unilateral or manipulative way, but in a continuous way, and also that God has feelings. Because in Whitehead's philosophy, energy equals feeling and feeling equals energy. And so wherever there's anything like mind or consciousness, there's feeling. And actually, there's mind everywhere, thinks
Mm.
Whitehead.
Mm.
So this means that God, among other things, feels the feelings of all living beings, not humans alone, actually shares in their experience. And thus, in Whitehead's words, is a fellow sufferer who understands. And that's his phrase. In response to what is felt, God then responds. And the way that God responds is by availing creatures moment by moment of lures for response, possibilities for fresh response to the circumstances faced. And so in human life, that would mean whatever decisions you've made or I've made or who, um, there's not a plan. It's not that they're ordained in advance, but God responds to whatever we've made of our lives um, by offering fresh possibilities for novel response. Now, all that will sound very familiar to a Christian.
Hmm.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like providence a little bit.
Mm.
Not sure what to make of the idea that God doesn't have a plan, but still, this is a personal God that's very active in the world. What will be shocking is that Whitehead did not think that God is all powerful. Uh,
Mm.
all loving, yes. Love was kind of the key. But there are many things that happen that even God not only does not prevent, but cannot prevent.
Mm.
Because the universe itself and you and I carry part of our very essence is a kind of self-creativity, a kind of spontaneity, an autopoiesis, moment by moment. Whitehead thought the essence of your actuality and my actuality is what he called decision, not conscious decision, but the act of cutting off certain possibilities and actualizing others. So we're always creating ourselves. And God can only work through and with this self-creativity. And this
Mm.
self-creativity isn't just in us. It's of course in other animals, it's in living cells, He thinks it goes all the way down into atomic events and quantum events in the depths of atoms.
Hmm.
And he also is inclined to think that the universe itself has no exact temporal beginning.
Hmm.
So there has always been, along with God, this self-creator spontaneity. Catherine Keller interprets that a bit as the to whom, the chaos from which
Mm-hmm.
God creates the world in the creation story.
Yeah.
Uh, Rabbi Bradley Artson, another process theologian, says the same. So they're taking a mythic image from the Bible and saying this is in part the self-creator spontaneity that goes all the way down into the depths of matter.
Hmm.
That's why God's not all powerful.
And,
It's not just that God chooses not to
mm-hmm.
be all powerful. It's that built into the very nature of things, God must work through persuasion, not coercion.
Yeah.
Invitation, not manipulation.
And just to pause there on that idea, because yeah, that might land as a surprise, this notion of, I grew up, right, there's God is omnipotent,
Yeah.
omniscient, omnipresent.
Omnipresent.
Yeah. But it's interesting though, because I also grew up in a very in a tradition that focused a lot on the Bible and on scripture as being sort of the
Right.
support for a lot of the claims about the divine. And it's kind of interesting that trying to look for support for all of those things in scripture can be actually a difficult thing. Like
Yeah, yeah.
the notion of an omnipotent deity, in some ways, I think some have made the point, comes much more from like Greek philosophy than
Right.
the Christian tradition. So I think that there's an interesting way that while at first hearing that idea might sound a bit startling, that God is actually not all powerful, but there's a different way of conceiving that. It might be, I don't know, comforting to more traditional minded folks to kind of appreciate that as a notion of doctrine or dogma doesn't really its support in the tradition is, I don't know, tenuous or something like that. Is there anything you can say to
No, I
that
think
idea?
it's true. I've read and I know enough about you to know that you know the Bible a lot better than I do. So I will rely on you. But it's my impression, Brendan, that quite often biblical literature presents God as in kind of a dialogical relationship
Mm,
uh, with human beings, but perhaps also with creation. But the notion of a dialogical or covenantal relationship where there's a kind of give and take, there's a response on God's part to what happens in the world. Um, and so that capacity, that responsiveness, that sounds a whole lot like process thought.
mm,
Uh, I'm sure there are aspects of the biblical traditions that present God as never being surprised,
mm,
um, but probably not as many as people think.
mm-hmm,
Uh, and there's many strands of the biblical traditions where God is moved
mm-hmm.
by what happens. God is not an unmoved mover,
Yeah,
and as in Aristotle,
right.
God is a moved mover, um, affected by things.
Mm-hmm,
Now, as it happens, I just want to mention this. In Whitehead's thought, there's a side of God which is timeless, um, non-temporal, just for the record. And this, to my mind, kind of taps into Neoplatonic traditions, that
mm-hmm,
Greek traditions that see something of the non-temporal and the divine. I think there's wisdom there.
mm-hmm.
Uh, for Whitehead, there's both the non-temporal and the temporal. Um, but actually, the temporal takes precedent. That's where God becomes love.
Mm,
In the non-temporal, you might say God is very wise, but not complete. Um, God is completed by the temporality of the world. One more thing on that, Brendan. It's easy to think of God in terms of spatial metaphors as kind of separate from, there's a spatial gulf
mm,
between God and the world. But Whitehead thought of God as the living whole.
mm.
of the universe with a life of its own. So, yes, God is personal, but as the living whole of a multifarious universe.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that to you because I've been reading your own work, and to see the importance that holism plays in your own thinking. So at some point we might want to talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a fascinating thing. And yeah, I mean, just briefly, well, yeah, like I find that the relationship that humanity has with the whole seems to be a really
Mhm.
important frame for thinking about, um, in a sense, what marks religion off as a distinct way of viewing the world from other frameworks that are offered.
Mhm.
You know, like there's a certain way in which a modern scientific reductionist materialistic description of reality also offers a sort of whole, but it's one in which we as humans tend to feel rather alienated from that. It's hard to find ourselves as a meaningful part of that whole. And so I think that there's definitely a way in which, yeah, we feel a need and a very important kind of desire to situate ourselves within the whole. And so I think that religion has always uniquely found the language to do that in a way that works versus other traditions. So anyway, I mean that's also worth naming too, that holistic aspect to this is maybe a way that other frames too of thinking about God and religion, such as pantheism or panentheism, might
Mhm.
enter
Mhm.
into some of this stuff. But I don't want to necessarily.
Oh,
Uh,
we can go there anytime. It's okay.
but no, I mean, but you were on a great sort of. You're trying to set this up a little bit in terms of the familiarities and the surprises that might you know.
So the two unfamiliarities would be that God is not all powerful in the sense of being able to exercise unilateral power, one-sided power. And the second is that the future is not known by God, because it doesn't exist to be known.
Mm,
Um, and so the future consists of possibilities, but they've not yet been actualized. And in the universe, it's something that actualizes them. So God knows what's possible in the future, but not what's actual until it's actual. And so we add knowledge to God that God did not have prior to that, namely the actuality of what happens. This, for some people, is very comforting in terms of theodicy.
mm,
It means bad things happen and they're not willed by God. They're not even part of a divine plan. But God shares in the suffering and provides possibilities for growth. That's very comforting, but also there's comfort for some people in the idea that it all fits into some kind of pattern that I can't see, but that is part of a divine plan. That's what process thought doesn't say, for good or ill.
mm-hmm,
There can be a plan, but it's a plan in the making.
mm-hmm.
It's a plan in process.
Well, and you could, yeah, I think, as you say, see that as a real strong suit in some ways, because as soon as you have the notion of an omnipotent and all-knowing deity, that has classically set up a lot of problems for the issue
Mhm.
of the problem of suffering and how do we, you know, how do we reconcile those two aspects? If God knew all this and could have the power to change it, why didn't he, et
Yeah,
cetera? And
right,
so,
right.
while in some ways this different perspective might trouble folks in the sense of maybe taking some of that sense of safety and security and the notion that everything is, you know, in his hands or something like
Mhm,
that.
mhm.
It also might resolve some of those latent, you know, anxieties or tensions or confusions around how these sorts of things play out. If you can allow that there is an openness, a you know, a lack of everything being totally accounted
That's
for
right.
in advance, et cetera. And so that might be, yeah, there might be certain kinds of hangups that traditional forms of Christian thought might find some resolution in that insight. So yeah.
I think they do. And Whitehead's cosmology was quite interesting in that it left open the possibility of the survival of consciousness after brain death. Now, it wasn't a dualism. It wasn't that there are two kinds of substances. Um, mental and physical. He actually rejected that. He thought there's one kind. He called them actual occasions of experience. But your mind, my mind, is a stream of experiences very much connected with our brains, but not precisely reducible to our brains. And it was imaginable to Whitehead that a journey continues after brain death, in which case there could be growth after death.
Mm.
And that too, that will make a bit of sense to a traditional
Mm-hmm.
Christian, but be, for some modernists, irresponsible and absurd. There's a part of the modernist
Mm.
worldview that says, no,
Mm.
we don't talk about things like that.
Mm-hmm.
We've gone past that. But I think a constructively postmodern perspective
Mm-hmm.
or a metamodern perspective can reopen itself to those possibilities. And there
Mm-hmm.
was a well-known process philosopher named David Ray Griffin who did a lot of work on paranormal psychology
Mm.
and out-of-body experiences and things like that. And he was a skeptic, and he became convinced that there's a good bit more to that
Sure.
than modernity ever allowed. So
Well,
in any case,
I was just
go
on
ahead.
that point. I mean, I think that also, to the degree that modernists want to be good empiricists, then they want to take into account the evidence, right? And however we interpret the evidence, there is a lot of evidence
Yeah,
that people have these experiences, and near-death experiences are incredibly common. And we've gotten to the point now where, there are repositories of accounts, that have been
yeah,
collected, and uh, there have even been some sort of meta studies and this sort of a thing, though those are largely inconclusive. But still, there's a lot of uh, phenomena that need accounting for that don't seem to fit into
yeah.
the tidiness of the modern sort of ontological framing of reality. And yeah, I think that we should acknowledge that. The only thing that I guess I tend to want to emphasize there um, is that we can also still frame that, I think, in kind of an open naturalism, right? That
Mhm.
there's a way in which our knowledge of reality is incomplete, and we have to acknowledge that,
Right.
and good scientists acknowledge that too. And so many things do happen that don't fit neatly into our current
Mhm.
paradigm that we have to presume that that paradigm is incomplete. And so I think that, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think also, while some of this, yeah, might sound surprising to the modernist, there's a way of relating to that information as, even from within the kind of scientific frame, science is itself always expanding its ken and hopefully developing its paradigms. So that whatever the nature of kind of the fullness of reality is, that is something that is continually being learned more and more about. So that people, do, I think, can appreciate that kind of information and not necessarily feel like, oh, I have to either reject this or, go to
Yeah.
a totally
I'm,
different kind of paradigm. It's just that given the nature of scientific progression itself, we can presume that we don't have the full story. So that's just, I don't know.
no,
Yeah,
yeah, as a process person, I hardly agree.
yeah.
And I think the question is, what do we mean by nature? Um, and so I don't think process thought thinks of itself as unnatural.
Hmm. Hmm.
It doesn't. You won't really much often find the phrase supernatural
Hmm.
among process folks, but you will find ultranatural.
Hmm.
That nature itself is probably more enchanted
Mm.
than we recognize,
Hmm.
and science can help us um, understand more. Actually, the enchanted
Hmm.
dimensions of the natural world. If science opens itself um, to that exploration, which some scientists do already.
Hmm. I would also say too that in my understanding of process thought, that there's, because it's like the philosophy of organism. I mean, we get
Mhm.
so much of that framework from biology, from the life
Yeah.
sciences, right? That there's something deeply familiar about this mode of thinking as being, in a certain way, at home in modern scientific thought as something inherently evolutionary, developmental, unfolding, processual, etc. Um, and so, yeah, that for me is also one point of deep continuity with sort of modern thought and process
That's
thought, which
right.
is,
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. When Whitehead wrote Process and Reality, he said in the preface that he wanted to draw upon four sources of wisdom. And one was science, and one was aesthetics, and one was morality, and one was religion. And
Mm-hmm.
that those were his terms.
Mm-hmm.
We might say science, art, spirituality, and religion,
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is, he really wanted to integrate those sources of wisdom, and he thought you could.
Mm-hmm.
He thought you could. Um, but it's at home in science. Whitehead actually loves science,
Mm-hmm.
and process people typically do. Where the difference can lie is that a mechanistic paradigm or framework for thinking scientifically can say there can be no action at a distance,
Mm-hmm.
that the only forms of causation are through immediate impact. They're collisions. And this is a paradigm that process thinkers think is short-sighted.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there are other forms of causation in addition to impact by which we're affected. Our psyches are affected by memories. Memories may not be totally explainable in terms of the molecular interactions within our brains. We can feel the feelings of things we experienced decades ago,
Mm-hmm.
almost intimately. So that's where the difference is really made. Is there anything like action at a distance?
And there's been so much, I think, really fascinating and important developments within contemporary scientific thought on this issue, actually,
Mhm.
because, for the longest time in the kind of classic modern reductionist frame, it was just efficient causation, right?
Right, right,
And now people are appreciating so much more the role that, something like Aristotelian final
right.
cause and formal cause are at play here. And a lot of this comes out of complexity science. And Hararo's Context Changes Everything is a great treatment of all
Mhm.
this. I've been reading a number of books. Terence Deacon's work also focuses a lot on trying to bring in final causation and
Yes,
goal-directedness. So I feel like there's been kind of a paradigm shift, actually, even within the sciences around appreciating how important these other forms of causation are.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. In process thought, by the way, we're being very metaphysical now, and I love that. But we want to go back to
Yeah, yeah. Let's
Christianity.
bring it back down to earth. Sure. Yeah.
But let's stay away from the earth just for 1 second.
Sure.
Um, in a lot of metamodern talk, there's talk about reality, um, and also ultimate reality,
Hmm.
and it can raise the question, which you've considered many times: what do we actually mean by reality? And it's interesting that for Whitehead, possibilities were as real as actualities.
Mm.
So reality kind of had at least two faces, possibilities and actualities. And there's a difference in that actualities have agency. They can actualize things.
Hmm.
And it's not clear that possibilities can actualize themselves, but they sure have power, and we're moved by them, and they shape us. Hopes for the future are a pretty good example.
Mm.
And so, just to stretch the notion of reality to include possibility as well as actuality. And then I think that Whitehead thought that the activity of God in the world is primarily through possibility.
Mm.
That's the kind of causation, the kind of power that the divine has in our lives.
Mm.
It's the power of being attracted to something, being drawn toward a possibility to be actualized,
Hmm.
moment by moment.
Well, while we're kind of on the relationship of process thought to sort of the modern frame, one of the things that strikes me as a meaningful divergence from a lot of kind of classic modern thought is that Whitehead is talking about God, right? I mean, he's
Oh,
using
oh,
theological
by the
language
way,
here. Yeah, and maybe you could just say a little bit about that, because obviously, I mean, Whitehead was he was a modern philosopher par excellence. You know, he did so much work with Russell and was an incredible mathematician and all this. So, I mean, he got all of that, and but the use of theological language for him, he's obviously drawing on these terms, but also meaning them in slightly different ways, maybe profoundly different ways in some cases. But yeah, I'm going to give you an impossible task here. But like when Whitehead talks about God, what is that? What is he referring to? I'm trying to get it somewhat as like how much of that is the God that, say traditional theists will be familiar with, and how much of that is a God that like modern scientists would see, but would just use different language for or something.
well, Whitehead's views changed,
Mm,
and in the beginning, in science in the modern world, he thought there has to be some factor in the universe which somehow negotiates relationships between the realm of pure potentialities and the actual universe. And I won't go into the specifics of why he thought that. And so he began to speak of some kind of agency on the basis of which novel possibilities become available for actualization in the world, in the universe. And that was the seed of the notion of a force, a something
hmm
that became what you might call a counter-entropic
hmm
lure, a counter-entropic lure, L-U-R-E.
hmm
There's something, despite entropy, by which the universe seems drawn in some way toward novel forms of order.
Yeah.
Atoms, molecules, stars, galaxies, living cells, multicellular organisms, organs, brains,
hmm
etc.
Yeah.
So a counter-entropic lure. So I think you begin with the notion of a counter-entropic lure. And he also thought that this is a little hard to get at, and tell me if I'm too confusing.
Sure.
But there's an intuition you and I can both have that there's a kind of activity of which everything is an expression.
Hmm.
Everything is a manifestation of some kind of activity, some kind of spontaneous self-expression.
Hmm.
Uh, and he had a name for that. He called it creativity.
hmm
But he didn't think that this counter-entropic lure could precisely be equated with the creativity.
Hmm.
It seems to work with the creativity. It may even be a manifestation of the creativity, but the creativity can go in many, many directions.
hmm
And yet this lure is toward order and novelty. That's the seed.
Yeah.
He gets to process in reality, and it begins to appear almost as a kind of cosmic mind.
Hmm.
This mind that prehends, that was his word,
hmm
uh, all the potentials. But the mind wasn't complete. It wasn't even fully actual until it felt, responded to what was actually happening in the world, because
hmm
consciousness involves not just mental activity, but a contrast
Hmm.
between the potential and the actual. So then he began to wonder, might this cosmic mind also be affected by the actual entities, the experiences that happen? I sometimes avoid the word world and use the word universe because it's really so much.
hmm
And that led him to wonder if there's a receptive side to this mind, a
Hmm.
side that feels the feelings of all things,
Hmm.
and that makes it complete and indeed conscious. And so that led him to talk about another side of God. The first side he called the primordial nature of God.
Hmm.
That second side he calls the consequent nature of God, because it's as a consequence of
Yeah.
what's actually happening. And so God becomes envisioned by him as actually both.
Mm.
It's really the togetherness of those two.
Hmm.
Now, is it fashionable to say that? It may be a little plausible to talk about a counter-entropic lure,
Hmm.
maybe, but it sounds sentimental to talk about something that actually feels the feelings of
Mm.
all things. That's where the modernist would say, "Yeah,
Mm.
I'm not sure I can go there."
Hmm.
Um, but Whitehead did. And if I can go on just a little bit,
Yeah,
the
by all
question
means.
is, what disposed him toward that? Well, part of it was for purely systematic philosophical reasons. I mean, it's kind of funny. In his scheme, every actuality needs a mental pole and a physical pole,
Mm.
and that includes God. But part of it was religious. He wrestled with the reality of loss,
Mm.
of things that happen that are quite beautiful sometimes, and they fall away and they perish as if they never had been.
Mm.
And he had a son that died in the war, and so this was
Mm.
personal.
Hmm.
But also, you just look around. It's not simply why are the bad things. It's what happens to the good.
Hmm.
What happens to it? Is it forgotten? Is it as if it were nothing? And so he gradually developed a sense of a kind of place, a kind of harmony, not located anywhere, where into which things feed,
Hmm.
and by which they are loved.
Hmm.
That's by which they are loved, a kind of deep memory,
Mm.
where even as things pass away, they're nonetheless preserved in that memory for what they were,
Hmm.
for whatever their beauty was. And that was an aesthetic feeling, and
Mm.
for him, a religious feeling.
Yeah.
Um, I think his talk about God as love originates not simply from scientific and philosophical considerations, but from existential aesthetic considerations.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, I have found some really fascinating convergences that I think have to mean something, um, between Whitehead's vision of this sort of all-preserving
Yeah.
God, but also you find this idea in Jung,
Uh-huh.
that somehow all the consciousness is preserved, is
Hmm.
contained,
Hmm.
is somehow, yeah, never really disappears, but it's kept in a kind of treasury or something like that.
Yes, yes, it's
And
good.
and then this idea also is very much in Dante. I mean, his vision of the
Mm-hmm.
empyreal rose, the celestial, you know, the celestial rose of God is where all of the multiplicity, all of
Mm-hmm.
the plurality of humanity sort of uh, participates in a timelessness or an eternity that retains its own individual nature, but is also participating in this sort of like universal nature, in a way that somehow, yeah, contains and captures and preserves all the good
Mm-hmm.
that has been. And so from philosophy to depth psychology,
Interesting.
to
Yeah.
religion to aesthetics, there just seems to be this gesture towards, yeah, some notion of the divine as that which preserves, and by means of this kind of embracing love, all that has been in some enduring way. And I find that a very beautiful
Yeah, that's
image too.
beautiful. That's beautiful, really. Um, and it grows, so this side of God is Whitehead said everlasting, not
Mm.
non-temporal.
Hmm.
So if eternal means
Yeah,
non-temporal,
yeah.
you're really talking about a treasure house that grows,
Hmm.
because new things are added to the treasure house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, gosh, there's so many avenues that we could go from there. I mean, on the one hand, I do have this enduring question, which part of me wants to ask. I'll just throw it out there and you can pick it up, or we could do something else. But there is an element to Whitehead's philosophy that, as you say, part of it does seem to stem from systematic philosophical concerns. But on the
Mhm.
other hand, there's this element that I get of just sort of like he seems to be positing a lot of things that for him just seem to be necessary.
Mhm.
And I could be misreading that or reading too much into that. But just that he does, yep, there is this God and it's got to kind of work something like this. And um, there's something about that. I mean, it's not a critique, it's something lovely, but it doesn't seem to, let's say, start from first principles and then
Oh
sort of,
no, yeah.
unfold. It sort of like starts from uh a rather already complex architecture of ideas that kind of hold
Mhm.
together
Right, I think that's right.
yeah. And I find that
It's not axiomatic.
right.
You don't begin with first principles and then deduce things.
Yeah.
It's developing a gestalt,
Yeah.
and the gestalt draws from many sources.
Yeah.
And really, the appeal is here's a gestalt, um, try it on,
Yeah. Well,
add to it, subtract from it.
yeah.
There's nothing final about it,
Yeah.
but here's a gestalt, and it does include a notion of divinity and all kinds of other things too.
Yeah. And so, yeah, in a minute, I'd love to hear you take this into, the elements of both continuity and maybe surprise from the postmodern lens. But before we get to that, though, a lot of my conversations around metamodern Christianity lately have been in that dialectical tension between the traditional and the modern and how we
Mhm.
relate to the traditional images and the language and the symbols and all of that through a modern lens. And this seems to come up in this context because it's like, it seems to me that that gestalt that you just described could be a very beautiful way in which someone could relate to their Christianity through so many of the traditional terms, ideas, stories, but sort of kind of interpreted through this
I
different
think
way
so.
of seeing it, right? That like that the God who saves that we were just
Mhm.
talking about or preserves is not so much the God of, the atonement who saves souls per se in a kind of maybe literal sense, but that there's a saving that goes on, that all that
Sure.
good that gets created is preserved.
Mhm.
And there's so many ways that you can kind of read a
That's
certain
right.
Christian theological perspective through this gestalt. So, do you have any thoughts on that and how that looks or what that feels like?
I think your intuitions are very much on target, and salvation itself is an ongoing process. There's an ongoing preservation. We hope.
Mm,
We hope. There need be no pretense to certainty
mhm,
here. Um, the aspect of your own thinking that I hear is how do you reconcile, if you can at all, historical critical approaches to the Bible
mm,
and including Jesus,
mhm,
um, in the idea that under such scrutiny he becomes an apocalyptic figure who expected the end of time and was battling demons and is a
mm,
far cry
mm.
from the image of gentle Jesus um, that we have in our imaginations, but that means so much to the devotional Christian. So I think there are lots of ideas in the process tradition that can help us interpret many, many, many dimensions of the Christian heritage. And by the way, that would include hard ideas like hell.
Mhm.
I'd love to
Mm.
work on a process notion of hell and
Yeah,
share that with you.
sure.
But I think, in the interest of time, I think, and how about Jesus for the Christian? Because that's so critical.
Yeah.
And like you, when I went to seminary. The Jesus whom I met through my modern scholars was not the Jesus of personal piety.
Mm.
What to do with that? So I think that Jesus too can evolve. And I think that historical Christianity um, is an ongoing process, not only of interpreting an historical figure in the past, but of living with and allowing to speak forth to us in our imaginations and us to that figure too. So I personally like to talk about the evolution of Jesus
Mm. Yeah.
and I do think that as a process person, I do think that he continues to live. In process thought, everything continues to live.
Mm.
It perishes in its immediacy, but becomes a field of force,
Mm-hmm.
and what comes thereafter. And I tell you, if Jesus said in the field of force, I don't know what is. There's a lot
Mm.
of fields of force, but he certainly is one. It's also possible. It's possible that the resurrection stories are that he appeared. From a process perspective, that's not supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way things can work.
Mm-hmm.
It, and so it's possible that he also lives as a consciousness after his death. I'm not sure about that, but what I am sure is he lives as a field of force. So I think that we can now allow Jesus to be transformed in our imaginations, albeit with some kind of continuity with who he was, but also building upon some of his own intuitions and aims, such that he becomes the loving savior that matters to so many people,
Mm-hmm.
even though he once was perhaps that apocalyptic figure.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a creative interpretation, a creative transformation of Jesus in the consciousness of historical Christians. You
Yeah,
got to be careful there.
sure.
I don't want Jesus to become a Nazi, but I do think we can think about Jesus and feel the presence of Jesus um, in new ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is
And
vital.
that means we can go ahead and do that scholarship. That's
Sure.
excuse me,
Yeah.
that's the point.
Yeah, no, and I don't know if I've ever or if I've yet stated this explicitly in any conversation or any video I've done yet, but like for me, I feel like it's not an either or. It can be very much a
Yeah.
both and, right? And precisely because we can engage Christianity itself as a process that's
Hmm.
undergoing change and development, and even a kind of divine or sacred process, right?
Yes.
That things aren't just changing, but they're caught up in this
Yes.
this novel creativity and this
Yes.
allure,
Yes.
in a powerful way that has a sacred nature to it. That I personally have no problem being able to separate, say, the Jesus of modern history from the
Hmm.
Christ of faith, and
Yes.
and then being able to relate these to each other, but also keep them distinct and to valorize the Christ of faith as being, you could say, more real and over and above,
Yes.
the just kind of the local reality of whatever may have happened physically or in space time or what have you, right? So for me, that becomes a very important move uh, that if we kind of allow ourselves that and don't feel so hamstrung by having to maintain a particular interpretive vision that has a lot of maybe kind of social pressure to maintain or what have you, all the dynamics that go into that. Um, I think that we can allow the image and the person of Jesus to continue
Hmm.
to develop and change and evolve and
Hmm.
grow, and in a sense become more Jesus, you could say.
Well, I think so too.
Yeah.
I think so too. When you think of when I think of myself after I die and am remembered, uh, I think that I can become my better self
Hmm.
as remembered. I mean, I'm okay, but I don't mind people lifting up aspects of me and running with them and transforming me into something that I can be, but perhaps am not.
Hmm.
I don't think my own identity is fully defined by this.
Yeah.
And that would be true of Jesus as well. Let let people be let people live in new ways.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's I think a very rich theological reading of that, especially once you appreciate that, like the idea of we are the body of Christ, and that
Yeah.
the identity of Christ in some ways continues to unfold through people's memory,
Yes. Yes.
interpretation,
Yes.
and all that.
That's a great insight. Yes.
Um, there is another thought though too that I wanted to bring in, which is that one of the values to me so much of sort of process thought is in its orientation, which is it is as the unfolding lure towards greater, you know, creativity and feeling and
Mhm,
sort of negative entropy, you could say. There's a directionality as time, though maybe this is conceived even outside of simple kind of temporal notions, but that things unfold in that direction, so that we kind of look forward to the fulfillment and the robustness and the
mhm,
realization in their totality of things rather than behind. And that
mhm,
seems to me, actually, again, while we're talking about a particular insight of modernity, one of those profound shifts that happens, right, where in the modern world, for good and for ill, people start to look less towards where they've been and look
mhm,
more towards the future.
mhm,
And conceived of philosophically and theologically, which in many ways, this is just a carrying forward of the Christian kind of eschatological vision of looking towards the future. This is, I think, a profound shift in our orientation towards reality and where value lies, because
mhm,
so much of our inclination as humans, for whatever reason, seems to be to want to find in the past the kind of eternal, perfect origins of where everything, comes from, and then sort of interpret everything that's happened as a kind of falling off, as a
mhm,
decay. Uh, there's all sorts of these stories of like the golden age from mythology, or various ideas about how we've kind of, well, even the fall itself is a version of this, of course, that things used to be perfect and now they're not. But I just continually see people wanting to find the foundations of their religious perspective somewhere in the past in
mhm,
a way that can carry them into the future. And it seems to be a novel and maybe for some disturbing notion that actually where things have been is not as complete as where they're going.
mhm,
And there's something to
mhm.
me about process thought that orients us more towards where we're going. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think I first discovered that idea through Hegel.
Mm,
And actually, it was just the idea that the whole doesn't yet exist and is in the making. And so we're on the way toward a whole that is not yet realized. Now, I kind of wish that Hegel hadn't thought that it was realized
yeah, right.
in
Yep.
19th century Germany.
Hmm.
But the idea that we're on our way toward a whole that does not yet exist, and that itself contains truth and goodness and beauty and aliveness and love. I just think that's a worthy ideal.
Mm,
It certainly sparks me. I'm also aware of the fact that many scripture-based traditions, well, probably many religious traditions as such, but that scriptures can function as anchors to a
mm,
fixed past
hmm.
and thus foreclose that kind of openness to fresh possibilities from the future. They
Hmm.
they can do otherwise, though. They can do otherwise. But this tendency to locate our foundations in what has been,
Hmm.
not what can be. I'm with you. I just see that everywhere. I myself, I think I subscribe to as a process thinker what you might call realized eschatology. And what I mean there is I do think that as everything happens, it actually becomes part of a harmony of harmonies. That's
Mm,
Whitehead's phrase.
hmm.
Um, Something wider, something richer, and actually is completed
Mm,
as best it can be completed. Then, so the whole envisioned as in the distant future is also a whole significantly realized in the present in the life of God.
mm,
Now, can more be added? Yes. Is there some kind of ultimate destination, either to the universe or to our own psyches or both? And those are relevant questions. I know that some Teilhardians like to talk about an omega point in which love is all in all. I actually think that's the consequent nature of God.
mm, hmm.
And so I actually think love is all
Mm,
in God, but that is not fixed or complete.
yeah.
it itself is on the way. So that's my eschatology,
Yeah.
but don't worship the past, not even the achievements of the past.
Yeah.
Go ahead and open yourself uh,
Yeah.
to the future. And that can take the form, by the way, of tremendous creativity. So I read your Easter poem.
Mm.
I listened to it,
Hmm.
and you just sensed that passion for the new and for the novel. I think that's one form that eschatology can take.
Hmm.
Um, the As you know, I responded to you. I think I responded to your poem by saying I'm still a little worried about the suffering of the individuals along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Was it the elk and the antelope? What was it? The elk and the in your
Yeah.
poem?
Yeah. Well, I think I originally had the lion and the elk, but then I realized I don't think lions and elks actually operate in the same ecosystem. I think, yeah. But what I meant was the lion and the antelope, whatever that predator prey relationship that
Yeah,
goes on
yeah,
there is caught up in a mode of conscious interaction that is of a different sort uh, that as consciousness itself evolves and deepens along this processual trajectory, we do deepen more into a moral awareness and sensitivity. And we also deepen more into our autonomy, I believe, to be able to mitigate suffering. And I feel like human beings are very much at that nexus point of like having this incredible power and the potential for incredibly deep levels of consciousness and moral
yeah.
sensitivity. But it's our calling to bring those things together in a way that can actually then more successfully mitigate suffering than what we've done. And so, yeah.
So my first book was called Of God and Pelicans,
Mm,
and it began with the story of pelicans that lay eggs, and they lay two eggs. And if the first egg hatches, the pelican mother takes care of that one, and the second one is pushed out of the nest
mm,
and dies of starvation or abuse.
mm,
But if the first chick dies, then the second one is taken care of. So my question was, what is the relationship of God to the second pelican chick,
mm,
to the one that's pushed out of the nest?
mm.
And I let that be a kind of symbol for me for all of the all the victims,
Yeah.
all the victims. And I concluded that that God shares in the suffering of that second pelican chick,
Mm,
and that the goodness of that chick's life is woven into um, the divine life.
yeah.
And so there, God is not only a lure, but a companion, not only a pulling force toward heightened consciousness, but an eternal companion to all that is,
Hmm.
for whatever it is.
Hmm.
And of course, that applies to people too.
Yeah.
So that's part of my realized eschatology. That's why I was worried about the lion or the elk.
Hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, there's some way, and I think this is a bit of a mystery and it can be conceived of in different terms, but there's some way in which uh, the the pathic suffering that our consciousnesses can experience is somehow experienced by the divine
Yeah,
consciousness.
yeah, yeah.
And to the degree to which that becomes a possibility, the whole issue of the theodicy question, I think, shifts because it's
Right.
not
I
then
think so.
just the kind of uh, you know, separate God looking down on a reality in which human
Right.
beings or just entities suffer. It's
That's
somehow
right.
the participation in that suffering. And again, this is how I feel like there's so much possibility for Christians to interpret, the story of the crucifixion and the
Right.
tradition around the death and resurrection as speaking to this profound truth that God took on the suffering
That's
of the
right.
world. And, again, for me, I don't have a problem not taking, how would I say? I don't have a problem distinguishing the truth of that claim from its historical trappings.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And relating to that truth on its own terms. And for me, that's what a metamodern spiritual or Christianity could, I think, help us do, is draw out of claims that are maybe presented in historical terms and allow us to see how they might actually represent or speak to
yeah.
grand theological realities. Yeah.
Uh, Are you familiar with Whitehead's phrase, lure for feeling? I don't know if that, yeah.
Yeah.
When Whitehead considered the nature of language, he used the word proposition, and that can sound like a
Hmm.
logical proposition, but it wasn't for him. A proposition was like a proposal. And so he said it's a lure for feeling. And so
Hmm.
he thinks that language functions in human life first and foremost as a lure for feeling,
Hmm.
for feeling. Now, for Whitehead, thinking is a form of feeling, imagining is a form of feeling, prehending is feeling.
Hmm.
But that means that events in the past can and do become lures for feeling
Hmm.
in what comes after,
Hmm.
and that it certainly includes the cross,
Sure.
um, and that includes Jesus. And so Whitehead tried to liberate language from its strictly logical function, or for that matter, even its sole function as concerned with truth. He said much language functions like a joke.
Hmm.
To tell a joke, it's not that you want to account for some truth.
Hmm.
It's that you want to evoke some sensibility.
Yeah.
And so you're a poet. Poetry functions this way. You
Very
know,
much so. Yeah.
poetry is
Yeah.
a panoply of lures for feeling.
Yeah.
And in that sense, Jesus too can be
Yeah.
a poem, a lure for feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I like that very much. I mean, that was a big turning point for me in my own faith journey of struggling with sort of the deconstruction and then finding a way beyond that is through the language of poetry and to be able to embrace all the richness and the truth that doesn't just reduce down to
yeah,
simple,
yeah.
propositional claims and whether you call that a
Right.
lure for feeling or whatnot. There's something so much more there that I think is itself kind of a metaphor for so many of the other ways that we in our experiences are irreducible to all the things that we tend to try to reduce our
Yeah.
experience to, and languages like that as well. And yeah, so much
One
there.
one other feature of that, Whitehead didn't develop it much, but language itself is not the sole means by which lures can be communicated.
Hmm.
So images
Hmm.
also,
Yeah.
gestures, movements, music,
Yeah.
dance, food.
Yeah.
So in a house of lures for feelings, there are many rooms, um, and some come from language,
Hmm.
and that includes oral as well as spoken and written language. So
Yeah.
just when you begin, lures for feeling propositions, thus understood, were actually a category of existence for Whitehead. If you look
Hmm.
at his in the introduction, he lays out 8 kinds of existing realities.
Hmm.
8. Uh, One was actual entities, one was pure potentialities, one was emotions. He called them subjective forms.
Hmm.
One was contrasts,
Hmm.
and that's juxtapositions of things by which they yield something that they would not yield in isolation.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, Propositions work with contrasts. I think propositions were one of the 8. I think I started that sentence thinking they were one of the 8, and now I think they're contrasts. I'm not quite sure.
Well, I mean, the broader notion there though of just is something that I think is really important, which is I feel like um, we can expand our understanding of the tradition, whether that's the language of scripture or the images or the symbols or the
Yeah,
whole rich,
or the
let's just
music, or the music.
yeah, the whole aesthetic tradition, but well, I don't want to say aesthetic to cheapen it or reduce it either. It just
Yeah.
all those things that are sense, those lures for feeling, the tradition can operate at that level in a way that is non-propositional.
Yes.
And I feel like if we could engage it as such, it's an invitation to deepen our faith lives so much beyond the hangups of
Mm,
did Jesus actually do this or
yeah.
did right? It's like that's comes to miss so much of the point, and that the richness of the tradition itself can gesture towards forms of experience, feeling, insight that are beyond what maybe the initial kind of propositional or
Yes.
historical impetus was. But so we should probably start to wrap up though, and for the sake maybe at this point of a kind of uh, artificial organization, because we've gone so many fascinating places here. But I would love to just hear you talk about closing that up with the postmodern relationship to process thought and what process thought, how that integrates and sort of finds familiarity with some postmodern insights, and maybe some of the things that it surprises there, if you wanted to finish that kind of line of thought of your essay.
I think one element of postmodernism that process thought resonates with, there's so much to postmodernism, as you know. I mean,
Yeah.
but one of the themes that surfaced is play,
Mm,
and just the freedom to be playful
mm,
and not to apologize for play, not to apologize for it. And I think process thought lends itself to appreciating the spirituality of play.
mm,
Now, one place where that comes up, we haven't mentioned beauty,
mm,
but beauty was actually a very important theme in Whitehead. He thought
mm,
everything is aiming toward beauty.
mm,
And beauty wasn't pleasant appearance. Beauty was richness of experience. And so it's richness of experience is the phrase used. That's Whitehead's value theory. A dog, a living cell, God enjoys
mm,
richness of experience. And that's more than that preoccupation with truth.
mm,
It's important. As important as that is, it's also more than goodness. As important as that is, truth and goodness are in service to beauty.
mm,
And beauty is richness of experience. And God's lure in the human heart is toward the fullness of life, a richness of experience, as
mm,
is possible. And one form that takes is play. And I think that's one point of contact.
mm,
A point of disjunction would be that process thinkers are critical realists.
mm,
I mean, they just think there's a world apart from our experience of it.
yeah.
As a matter of fact, they have a concept. Whitehead had a concept: experience in the mode of causal efficacy. That's his phrase. We experience ourselves as being affected by
Mm,
things that are other than us. We don't will them into existence. We are moved by them into our own existence.
yeah.
The most intimate instance of which is our own bodies. But the physical world around us and people and moods and you name it. There's so much of our experience that's not reaching out, but rather being reached into,
Mm,
being that erupts from being affected. So that's the experiential ground of critical realism. Do we interpret what we experience? Of course we do. Are our interpretations finite and fallible? Of course they are. But we are trying to interpret something.
mm,
We are trying to do something that's given to us that we don't will into existence. So that would be a
yeah.
disjunct with aspects of postmodernism. Here's a conjunct. Um, Emmanuel Levinas's notion of the face of the other.
Yeah.
And you experience in the presence of the other or the face of the other a kind of givenness.
Mm,
And this is my language, not his, but they are subjects of their own lives and not just objects for us.
mm,
And they make a claim upon us, including a moral claim. You must take me into account.
mm,
I think process thought is at home with that and can be enriched by Levinas, by the way, because in process thought, everything is alive with its own life,
mm,
its own subjectivity, its own reality, and it makes a claim upon us. Of course, that includes people. Process thought would expand that to include other animals,
mm,
and one way or another, the whole schmear,
yeah.
the stars, the planets, the hills, the
Mm,
rivers. So that would be a point of contact. Um, a point of disjunction insofar. I've just been hearing a podcast on Derrida, and the kind of the turn to writing
Mm-hmm.
as a subject of its own, and a tendency to understand everything in terms of text.
Yeah.
I think that's just not process thought.
Mm-hmm.
Text is good, but it's sure not the whole of it.
Mm-hmm.
There's the whole world of feeling. So those are some. The probably the biggest contrast, though, would be its openness to God.
Mm-hmm.
You just understood as a subject of God's own life.
Yeah.
The living whole of the universe with its own life.
Yeah.
I don't hear that much in postmodern thinking,
Mm-hmm.
maybe with the exception of of Kierkegaard.
Yeah.
How about you?
Well,
But actually, you know some Catholic writers there. Go ahead, you talk.
oh, well, I was just going to say, I mean, I wanted to acknowledge this point that you've made and others have made too around this notion of constructive postmodernism, which is I think from what I've heard described of it, very much akin to, if not directly overlapping with metamodern, takes on these things. And it's just kind of a the nature of things that people have been grappling with postmodern thought now for many decades, and there's already been so much great work done from thinkers in process circles, in integral circles, in various forms of I don't know, Habermasian thought, and certain kinds of reactions to and responses to uh, postmodernism that the metamodern has a natural affinity with,
Yeah.
and isn't trying to sort of colonize or appropriate or take take ownership of in some way, but just that those ideas find a home very much in, I think, the
Mhm.
metamodern discourse. And so just wanted to throw that out there in terms of a lot of the things that people will be hearing about metamodern religion, metamodern Christianity. Yeah, there have been pioneers in these ways of thinking now for some time. What's exciting to me is that there does seem to be a new kind of momentum or inertia around
Yeah.
these thoughts, that they're sort of coalescing into something that has a kind of impact in a way that I find very encouraging. So I just wanted to throw that into the mix. I
Well,
wasn't, yeah.
I mean, in my in my own language, I've started calling myself a metamodernist, and so
Hmm.
I don't know if I have permission to so do,
Oh,
but
by all means.
I think process thought is a lineage within the
Yeah,
metamodern movement, and
certainly.
it once called itself constructively postmodern. That phrase can still be helpful, but metamodernism is now wider
Hmm.
than the process lineage, and I think the process lineage is happy to be part of a larger movement
Mm,
that you're really helping bring into effect, and I'm really grateful
thank you.
and impressed and
Thank you very
inspired.
much. I appreciate that. Um, yeah, I mean that is very much hopefully the goal, and what we'll continue to see happen is, people are butting up against some of the real ways in which certain limits of all the previous modes of
Mhm.
thinking are kind of experiencing certain yeah, limit cases, and people are realizing that while there's incredible value in these different modes of thought, somehow there needs to be a way in which you can bring these together and also avoid a lot of the pitfalls of their excesses and whatnot. And so I'm glad to see a lot of the postmodern excesses begin to be critiqued and
Yeah,
fall away, and just some momentum. And ultimately, names are names, and any good theologian, especially an apophatic one, will know that names are just, a kind of superficial thing. So whatever this winds up ultimately being called, if there is an ultimate to any of this, then it's really about what are we moving into?
yeah,
What does the next thing look like? And how can this help people live full, rich, flourishing lives, especially in the midst of all this kind of upheaval and crisis? So anyway, yeah, very happy to have so many streams and lineages and traditions influencing what's happening. And I think process thought is a big, very big aspect of that. So
The many
Yeah,
become one and are increased by one, and process is just among the many. It's one among the many.
there you go.
But the one is never final. So,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, I know you know that.
Well, this was a delight. I really enjoyed this. I appreciate you taking the time. I will link, yeah, to some of your work and this article that you've written. And I've really been, yeah, delighted to see the
Thanks,
work
yeah,
that
Brandon.
you're doing and engaging with metamodernism, and look forward to many more synergistic, connections and maybe some more talks down the line. But for now, Jay
Let that
McDaniel,
be. Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Take care.